late 1944, German crews began whispering the same sentence with a mix of pride and dread. This is the perfect tank. It looked like the answer to years of retreat. Thick, sloped armor that seemed to turn enemy shells into sparks. A long high-velocity gun that could kill before the opponent even understood the range. Optics that made distant targets look close, and a turret that felt like a fortress. But the battlefield was no longer decided only by what a tank could do in a duel. It was decided by bridges, fuel, rail lines, spare parts, and the simple question of whether the machine could arrive. Germany's late war love affair with the perfect tank was built on a hard lesson. Earlier designs were dangerous, but they were vulnerable when enemy guns improved. Commanders wanted a vehicle that could win head-on engagements at practical ranges. They wanted protection that did not rely on luck, and firepower that did not require closing distance. That desire produced the Tiger II, often called the King Tiger. On paper, it was everything a crew could ask for. Its frontal armor was thick and sharply angled, designed to defeat many rounds before they could bite. Its main gun, the 8.8 centimeter KWK-43, had long reach and brutal penetration. From a good firing position, it could dominate a road, a field, or a village approach. If an enemy tank entered its sight picture, the outcome could be decided in one clean shot. Yet the King Tiger carried a hidden bill. To gain that armor and gun, it became extremely heavy, nearly 70 tons, and weight changes everything. Weight is the bridge that breaks, the rail car that cannot be found, the recovery vehicle that cannot tow, the road that turns to mud, and the fuel tank that empties too soon. A heavy tank does not just fight the enemy, it fights the map. Production itself was a battle. The King Tiger needed large armor plates, precision machining, and careful assembly. Factories worked under air raids and shortages. Inspection suffered, experienced hands disappeared, and small deviations became big failures. When the machine rolled out, it looked like perfection. Inside, it often carried the stress fractures of a collapsing industrial system. The first judge was movement. A tank that cannot reach the front is not a weapon. It is a burden parked in the rear. Heavy tanks needed rail transport for long distances, and rail transport depended on intact lines and predictable timetables. By 1944, rail yards were targets, bridges were cratered, and trains moved under constant threat. A delay could strand armor far from the crisis it was meant to solve. A detour could force a unit onto roads that could not support the weight. Then came the bridges. Europe's countryside was stitched together by rivers and canals, and every crossing asked the same question: can you hold this load? Many bridges were built for civilian traffic and lighter vehicles. Some could take a heavy tank once, slowly, if the span was intact and the approach was solid. Others could not, and commanders learned the hard way. A perfect tank that cannot cross a river becomes a perfect spectator. Routes narrowed into a few safe crossings, and predictable routes became kill lanes under Allied aircraft. Fuel was the next wall. By late 1944, Germany's fuel situation was desperate. A heavy tank consumes fuel like a furnace. Fuel was for repositioning, retreat, and escaping artillery patterns. When fuel ran thin, commanders rationed movement. They saved the tanks for contact, then discovered that contact often demanded movement first. The King Tiger's weight also magnified mechanical strain. The driveline carried enormous loads, and components that might survive in a medium tank failed under a heavy one. Final drives, transmissions, and tracks lived under constant stress on bad roads and winter mud. Crews could win a firefight and still lose the tank on the retreat when a gear ground itself apart. A breakdown near the front was an emergency because recovery was difficult and the enemy was closing. Recovery exposed another hidden weakness: time. To tow a heavy tank, you needed another heavy vehicle, good cables, solid ground, and hours you could not afford under shellfire and air threat. If recovery failed, crews faced a brutal decision. They stripped optics, removed radios, destroyed sensitive parts, and set charges. The tank could become a smoking wreck by night, not because it lost a duel, but because the system behind it could not save it. And still, when the King Tiger did fight, it could be terrifying. There were moments when its gun and armor created a wall the Allies had to respect. Allied tanks that approached carelessly could be destroyed at ranges that felt unfair. Infantry learned to fear the long barrel pointing out of fog because it meant the road ahead could become a graveyard in minutes. Some commanders tried to solve the problem with engineering tricks. They searched for fords, reinforced crossings with timbers, and moved at night to avoid aircraft. They broke columns into packets to reduce dust and noise, but each workaround cost time. And time was the resource Germany could not manufacture. The perfect tank kept arriving later, and later meant weaker. But the war's logic was colder than belief. A tank is judged by how often it arrives, how long it stays, and how easily it can be put back into the fight. The King Tiger demanded an intact network of bridges, rail lines, fuel depots, repair shops, and trained crews. By late 1944, that network was shattered, and perfection became a weakness. This story is not about mocking German engineers. It is about the mechanics of industrial war. A perfect tank can be strategically imperfect when the nation behind it cannot move it, feed it, or fix it. Its greatest enemy was not the Allied gunner. It was the distance between the factory in the front and the shrinking time left to cross it. A lone crewman stands by that detour sign, reading the arrow as if it were a verdict. The road vanishes into mist, and somewhere beyond the fog is the front he was promised. Behind him, the heavy tank waits like a cathedral of steel, but the map has begun to argue with the machine. Orders in late 1944 sounded confident on paper. Hold the crossroads, seal the breach, counterattack at dawn. In practice, every order passed through 3 gates: bridge capacity, fuel availability, and whether the route still existed after the last air raid. A heavy tank battalion could be the strongest fist in the army and still arrive hours too late, because the road network had become a battlefield of its own. Commanders learned to plan movement like a crime. Daylight meant aircraft, so columns moved at dusk and before sunrise, then hid under trees, netting, and ruined barns. That hiding bought survival, but stole momentum. A tank designed to dominate distance now spent half its life parked, waiting for darkness, waiting for a fuel truck, waiting for engineers to certify the next crossing. Perfection was turning into delay. Bridges were the most merciless judges because they were indifferent to bravery. A span either held 70 tons or it did not. When it did not, the battalion did not choose another way in minutes. It searched for a stronger bridge, a railhead, a ferry, or a ford, then rebuilt its entire schedule around that choice. Detours created predictability, and predictability created ambushes. Allied reconnaissance watched junctions and likely crossings, then called in artillery or airstrikes that turned the approach roads into craters. The heavy tank's strength forced it onto the very routes the enemy could anticipate. Fuel tightened to the trap. A heavy tank's engine could drink through a ration faster than a commander could replace it. Crews counted liters like ammunition. A short tactical reposition might be approved, then canceled, then approved again, because the supply officer could not promise the next delivery. In defensive war, movement is life, but movement costs fuel, and fuel had become a shrinking privilege. Mechanical strain finished what bridges and fuel began. Weight multiplied stress in the drivetrain, and rough roads multiplied it again. A final drive that might survive on a training range could crack on a retreat road full of rubble. A thrown track could consume hours under fire. A cooling system pushed hard by low-speed mud travel could overheat at the worst moment. And once the machine stopped, the battlefield did not wait politely for repairs. Recovery was the cruelest test of all. Towing a disabled heavy tank demanded another heavy vehicle, solid ground, intact cables, and time that air power and artillery refused to grant. If the pull failed, the crew faced an ugly choice: abandon a symbol or destroy it so it could not be captured. That decision was not panic. It was mathematics. A perfect tank that cannot be recovered becomes an enemy trophy or a roadblock for your own forces. The Allies understood the pattern and turned it into a method. They did not chase heavy tanks across open fields, hoping for a fair duel. They attacked the system that kept them alive: rail lines, bridges, fuel dumps, repair parks, and the roads that connected them. They mined likely routes to force a halt. They shelled junctions to slow recovery. They used smoke to break sight lines, then used artillery to immobilize, because a stationary heavy tank could be finished later. Their aim was not always to burn it immediately, but to make it late, make it stuck, make it absent. When the heavy tank did fight, it still imposed respect. From a hull-down position, its gun could erase an advancing vehicle with one hit and set a column on fire. Its armor could deflect hasty shots, buying seconds that felt like minutes. Infantry learned to fear the long barrel in the fog because it meant the road ahead could collapse into chaos. But each firing position also revealed the tank's location, and in 1944, a revealed location was an invitation for aircraft, artillery registration, and encirclement. German crews adapted with quiet discipline. They carried spare track links and wheel hardware, turning a field edge into a workshop. They moved in smaller packets to reduce dust signatures. They hid under nets and in orchards, avoiding engine revs that carried sound across valleys. They learned which components failed first, and they listened for those sounds like doctors listening to a heartbeat. Yet discipline could not conjure fuel, and skill could not repair a bridge that no longer existed. The result was a war of appearances. The perfect tank arrived, fought briefly, then disappeared, sometimes by retreat, sometimes by breakdown, sometimes by deliberate fire. To the enemy, that brief appearance was trauma. To its own crews, it was exhaustion. They were asked to be everywhere with machines that could not travel freely, in a landscape where every road was watched and every gallon mattered. By the time winter deepened, the question had shifted. It was no longer, can this tank win a duel? It was, can this tank reach the duel, survive the retreat, and be ready again tomorrow? And more often, the answer was decided before the first shot, at the bridge sign, at the empty drum, at the delayed train. The tank remained powerful, but power without a rival is theater. In the end, bridges, fuel, and time did not merely slow perfection. They rewrote it. They turned the most feared machine into a rare event, then into a stranded silhouette. then into smoke on a roadside, and the men who built it learned the final lesson of industrial war. Victory belongs to the weapon you can move, feed, and repair, not the one you can admire. Somewhere in the fog, another crossing waits, another fuel receipt is stamped, another crew counts minutes. The perfect tank still looks unbeatable until the map speaks again in the morning light. Morning light does not care how armor is, it cares where the road goes, which bridges still stand, and whether the fuel truck arrives before the aircraft do. By early 1945, Germany's perfect heavy tank had become a weapon that appeared in flashes. When it arrived on time, in a prepared position, it could freeze an entire advance. Allied crews felt the same cold realization. A frontal shot was a gamble, and distance belonged to the long gun. But those flashes were getting rarer because the conditions required for perfection were disappearing one by one. The first condition was a route that could carry the weight. Heavy tanks demanded specific roads, specific crossings, and sometimes specific weather. A bridge might hold in summer and fail in winter when timber swelled and nails loosened. A road that looked firm could turn to slurry under thaw, sucking tracks into ruts that stole speed and overheated engines. Commanders tried to plan around these variables, but planning became guesswork when the front moved daily and the sky belonged to the enemy. The second condition was time. A heavy tank battalion was not only metal, it was paperwork, rail schedules, engineer checks, recovery plans, and fuel allocations. Every delay compounded the next. A late train meant a night spent in a yard exposed to air attack. A detour meant a longer march that consumed fuel. A fuel shortage meant the unit arrived with enough power to shoot, but not enough power to move again. In that chain, perfect became a word for what the situation refused to provide. Allied forces exploited that chain with ruthless economy. They watched predictable crossings. They attacked rail junctions rather than chasing tanks through fields. They mined likely approaches and shelled roadheads where recovery vehicles had to work. They used smoke to break sight lines and artillery to force heavy tanks to reposition, because repositioning cost fuel and exposed flanks. They did not need to destroy every tank immediately. They needed heavy tanks to be late, separated, and unable to repeat their success. When the heavy tank did fight, the battlefield still had to respect it. A single hull-down position could dominate an approach for hours. A long-range hit could set off ammunition and turn an armored column into a blocked road. Infantry could be pinned by the threat of one accurate shell. Yet every shot was also a signal. In 1944 and 1945, a signal meant the enemy would register the position, mark the road, and begin tightening a ring of fire. German crews learned to live inside that ring. They practiced minimal movement, conserving fuel for the moment the enemy finally committed. They chose positions with escape routes, then watched those routes disappear as bridges were blown and roads cratered. They carried spare parts like talismans, but spare parts could not replace a rail line. They listened for the first grinding note in the drivetrain, and they feared it more than distant gunfire, because grinding meant the tank might stop where it could not be saved. The most painful defeats were quiet. A unit might withdraw at night, engines low, columns spaced, and then one heavy tank would falter on a slope. The driver tried again, the engine surged, and the transmission answered with a sound like tearing cloth. The tank rolled backward a meter and settled. Behind it, the road filled with frustrated vehicles. Ahead of it, The map offered no alternate crossing. The unit had to choose: spend hours attempting a tow under shell threat, or accept the loss and keep moving. Sacrifice became routine. Optics came out first, wrapped carefully as if they were civilian glass. Radios were removed and smashed or carried away. Documents were burned. Charges were placed where the engine and transmission would be ruined. Then the crew stepped back into the darkness, watching the fire grow, not with drama, but with resignation. The perfect tank was being destroyed by its own side because the war had decided it could not be moved. That moment carried a bitter irony. The tank was built to defeat enemy fire, yet it was defeated by the need to cross a river, the need to refuel, and the need to arrive before morning aircraft. It could win a duel and still lose the campaign, because a duel is a moment and a campaign is a system. This is the moral center of the story. Engineering can create extraordinary capability, but capability does not equal victory. Victory requires repetition, the ability to field power again and again, in many places, over many days. Heavy perfection demanded stable logistics, and stable logistics were exactly what Germany lost under bombing, retreat, and fuel collapse. The Allies, with deeper industrial output and air dominance, could absorb losses and return with replacements. Germany could not, and so every perfect vehicle that burned on a roadside reduced the future to fewer options. The legend survived because the encounters were unforgettable. Crews remembered the shock of rounds bouncing off the front plate, the sudden destruction from long range, and the helpless feeling of being seen first. Those memories spread faster than production numbers. Yet the ruins on roadsides told a different truth. Not a duel lost, but a bridge too weak, a train too late, a depot too empty, a morning too bright for safe movement. In the end, the perfect tank did not fail because it was weak. It failed because war is a system, and the system said no. Bridges limited where it could go. Fuel limited how often it could move. Time limited how many chances remained. When those limits tightened, perfection became an anchor. The fog lifts, the detour sign still points away from the shortest road, and the crew still counts minutes. They are not counting for the enemy. They are counting for the map, for the fuel, and for the sunrise, because in the final year, those forces decided whether the perfect tank would fight or burn. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this WWII engineering and logistics story, please subscribe for more full episodes. The subscribe link is in the description.